Vote by mail has already begun, and early voting in Duval County starts Monday. Are you prepared to cast your ballot? To walk us through some key contests and best practices for voting, we're joined by local political expert and attorney Chris Hand. Good morning, Chris.
And great to see you as always.
Great to see you as well. There's a lot to talk about, and we'll get to some of it, including some disinformation that has been raising concerns. But I want to start with a pair of rulings out of Georgia in the last couple of days that have some significant impacts for how elections could be certified.
Well, very important. Of course, a variety of Georgia counties are in the WJCT listening area, and Georgia is one of those seven key swing states that we've seen so much attention to. So there's kind of an increased national focus on how Georgia is administering its elections. Of course, we saw that 4 years ago when Joe Biden won Georgia by about 11,000 votes. A lot of focus on Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, local elections officials, and that continues to be the case in 2024, given how close that contest is there. Uh, Georgia is governed by a statewide elections board, and there are often county elections boards as well. That statewide election board had put some rules in place that were very controversial. Both Democrats and some Republicans objected to those, and one of those was a requirement that poll workers at individual precincts actually, in addition to the machine count of ballots, actually hand count ballots as well. This occurred very late in the process. There was a lot of concern that that would delay the overall vote count, create a lot of complexity and confusion in the voting process. Over the course of the last couple of days, a Fulton County judge in the Atlanta area has enjoined the State Board of Elections from enforcing that regulation, arguing that it came too late in the process, might create confusion. And so that, as a result of that ruling, unless there is some sort of successful appeal, that hand count rule will not be in place. That same judge also made it clear that local elections officials, those local election boards I'm referring to, are required to certify the ballot. They're not investigatory agencies. To the extent anyone raises claims about, kind of election fraud or anything like that, those local election boards, that's not their job to investigate that. Georgia state law says that they shall certify the election results after a certain period of time following Election Day. The judge upheld that provision, Georgia statutory law, saying that, again, those election officials their job is to count the ballots, certify the count, and sort of pass that on.
And explain to us why, something like having a hand count of ballots and the delay that that could conceivably create, why that would be a concern.
Well, I think it would create a concern because number one, it adds complexity to the process. Most jurisdictions have obviously adopted machine counting because it's more efficient, seen as more accurate than a hand count would be. If you add a hand count to that, you're going to obviously add time to that process. I think people who were concerned about that said it could add an enormous amount of time to the process, thus delaying sort of certainty about what the election results actually are. And as we've seen in kind of recent elections, that issue of certainty versus uncertainty can make a big difference as you are trying to move past the election into what is then the governing phase.
I want to ask you, just in your estimation, do you have a sense as to when election results might be available? I mean, I think it's important for people to have some sense of anticipation realistically when that election could be called.
In this state, we're going to have results pretty quickly. In recent elections, up to half, or maybe even in some cases more, of voters cast their ballot before Election Day, either by mail or by early voting. There are, of course, still a number that vote on Election Day itself. Florida is a state that goes ahead and tabulates its votes by mail and its early votes before Election Day itself. That's why, for example, here in Duval County, you see Supervisor of Elections Jerry Holland and his team. They will post results very quickly after polls close at 7 p.m. because they've already tabulated those early votes and mail votes that have come in. That is not true in every state. So, for example, in states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, they cannot actually start counting votes by mail or early votes until Election Day itself. So, what happens is you see kind of a protracted process. For example, in 2020, Joe Biden was not declared president elect until several days after Election Day. So, I think people should be prepared for a little bit of a longer count. You may hear some suggestion on election night that those are the results that count, that, the counting that's happening after election day, isn't real or doesn't count. That's a myth. That's not true. In a bunch of states, including Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, you're going to have a count that goes on for a little while because under those states' laws, they can't actually start counting some of those early ballots until election day itself. So we're now more in a situation and where it's not so much election day anymore from a count perspective. It's now more like election week. And so I'm going to be back here on Wednesday, November the 6th. We may not know who the next president of the United States is that morning because there will still be counting going on in some of these key swing states.
And of course, yeah, I mean, those 2 states are not, insignificant in
No.
terms of the results of this election.
Well, and there are states that conduct some or all of their balloting via mail, whether that's Washington State, Oregon, the state of California. Again, in a lot of those cases, in some of these states, there's a deadline to have your ballot postmarked by election day. For example, here in Florida, if you vote by mail, your ballot has to actually be received by your county supervisor of elections no later than 7 p.m. on election day when the polls close that day. In some states, there's a postmark deadline. So again, those states are still receiving ballots after election day itself, which prolongs the counting process.
If you're just joining us, we are talking about the upcoming elections with attorney and political expert Chris Hand. If you have questions for him about casting your ballot or any of the races on your ballot, you can reach us at 904-549-2937. You can email First Coast Connect at wjct.org. Chris, since you touched on it, there are rules with different kinds of voting, and it's important that people understand those different rules. I work with people here who've already cast a ballot. That's mail-in voting. So those went out in August. That's already underway.
Well, it is, and there are quite a few Floridians who have already voted, by mail, as you said earlier, and that's one of the options that we have. And again, as I said a minute ago, if you do vote by mail, your ballot must be received by 7 p.m. on election day. And there's really two ways to return that mail ballot. One is to follow the instructions, and please read those instructions carefully that you received in your mail ballot to return it by mail. The U.S. Postal Service can sometimes take a little bit of time, particularly on these ballots. So I think very important if you're going to return it by mail to do that as quickly as possible to allow adequate time for your ballot to go from the mailbox to the supervisor of elections. You can also return those at what are called election drop boxes, which exist either at the supervisor of elections office or at early voting sites. So when early voting sites are open, or at the supervisor of elections office when it's open, you can hand deliver your mail ballot to those sites as well. So that's one option. The other one, as we said, is early voting, which in this county starts next Monday, October the 21st. Will run through the Sunday before election day, so we'll run through November the 3rd, and offers people an opportunity to vote. I think for example, we have 24 early voting sites here in Duval County. Kudos to Supervisor Jerry Holland, who's been aggressive about making sure that there are a large number of early voting sites dispersed proportionally around the county. Those will be open, I believe, from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. on weekdays and from 8 to 5 on weekends. So that's an opportunity for people to bank their vote early, or, of course, at their local neighborhood precinct on election day itself. Polls will be open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. One thing I think that's really important in this process, and we'll talk more about this, that not only do voters inform themselves about the races on the ballot, but they also have a plan for their voting. Obviously, this is an election that's going to have a very high turnout. There's a lot of interest in the election. As evidence, for example, yesterday, Georgia was the first day of early voting in Georgia. They set a record of more than 320,000 people cast early votes. That almost tripled the previous record of what Georgia had seen. So there's a lot of interest in this election. Make a plan, whatever method you're going to choose, whether that's vote by mail, early voting, or your precinct. Know how you're going to do that. Make sure you're familiar with the rules. Schedule time to go vote, and I think people will find the process much easier that way.
I just want to touch on the mail-in ballot. If you've mailed in a ballot or when you mail in a ballot, you actually can go online and make sure your ballot's been received.
Correct. So, for example, let's say you live here in Duval County, and this is true for other counties as well, but you go to duvalections.com, and there is a way you can actually track the course of your mail-in ballot to make sure it's been received. There's a vote-by-mail tracker there. So really encourage people, whatever county you're in, whether you're in Duval, St. John's, Clay, Nassau, Baker, Flagler, any other county, familiarize yourself with that supervisor of elections website. There's a lot of key information there. They tend to provide very clear rules and best practices for voting, and a lot of information on the candidates and on, for example, the early voting sites. Like I said, there's 24 here in Duval County. I believe there's 9 in St. Johns County. I think there's 7 in Clay County, 5 in Nassau County, and 1 in Baker County. And those numbers are proportional to the size of these different counties. But that is an increasingly favored way to vote, to go to an early voting location.
Right, and you noted that on Monday, which is the 21st, that process begins of early voting in Duval County. Also, same day in St. Johns. Early voting starts in Clay County on Tuesday, the 22nd, and then in Nassau County on Wednesday, the 23rd. You talk about making a plan, and I think it's important for people to prepare for a lengthy ballot. So you can go on your supervisor of elections website and print out. You've actually brought one with you, a sample ballot.
Well, that's right. So every Duval County voter, for example, just to use the county we're in right now as an example, received a sample ballot, and I'm holding. People who are seeing this via video can see it. I'm holding the sample ballot that I received yesterday, which is essentially 2 full pages. I mean, there's a lot on this ballot, from the presidential contest to a U.S. Senate race to state legislative races to constitutional amendments. Some individual communities, like for example here, Jacksonville Beach and Atlantic Beach, not only are electing local officers, but also have a variety of charter amendments they're considering. This is going to be a really long ballot. So that's another part of the process. When you receive your sample ballot, if for some reason you don't, as you suggested, Ann, going on the Supervisor of Elections website to make sure you see it there, it's important to take time to study that ballot, understand what's on it, understand the choices that you're being asked to make, and important for voters to inform themselves. We've said it on this program before, but in my opinion, the most important role in democracy is that of citizen, and the most important form of citizenship is voting. It's really important that we inform ourselves before we actually fulfill that responsibility.
Yeah, and I know I'm among the people that on occasion have gone into the ballot booth not completely prepared. It's a very frustrating feeling to get to a race and you're like, I didn't bother to look at the soil and water conservation district candidates. Or, in St. Johns County at the very end of the ballot is going to be a question about whether there should be a school tax. So there's a lot of issues that are worth attention, but they really do require some advanced study.
Well, let me give some resources that I think people would be wise to pay attention to. One exists right here in this building we're sitting in, and that's jackstoday.org. Jacksonville Today has done a really good job establishing voter guides for almost every proposition on the ballot with a lot of key information. Highly recommend that people go to jackstoday.org, check out the voter guides, and see the information. It's not slanted in one direction or the other. It's sort of, as Sergeant Joe Friday used to say, just the facts. Facts about some of these candidates and propositions that are on the ballot. I'll also tout another news organization I'm affiliated with, WJXT News for Jacks, also has a voter guide. Use those sorts of resources and also the ones at the Supervisor of Elections office to make sure you know as much as possible about these candidates and propositions on the ballot.
Yeah, it's worth noting that the supervisor of elections in Duval County website actually links to the Jacks Today voter guide, which I think is a good vote of confidence. I want to take a couple of calls. We've got a call from Jim in downtown. Good morning, Jim. Go ahead.
Hey, Ann. So when the supervisor of elections is actually on the ballot in the city election in Jacksonville, who counts the ballots then?
It is an elected position, Chris.
Supervisor of Elections office does that. So it's on the ballot in the odd numbered years. It sort of tracks with the city of elections, which are in March and May of the odd numbered years. We had the last one in March of May of 2023. So the Supervisor of Elections office does that as well. They handle the balloting for that. There's no special dispensation just because that office happens to be on the ballot.
I mean, I guess implicit in Jim's question is that a best practice for someone to be counting votes for an office holder that is, up for election?
Well, there have been suggestions over time that perhaps those supervisors' races shouldn't be elected. Perhaps they should be appointed offices, or, there's some other way of handling that. As far as I know, there's never been a situation in recent Florida history where there's ultimately proven to be any valid concern about the supervisor of elections overseeing kind of an election for that office in particular. understand Jim's concern potentially about a perceived conflict of interest. I'm not aware of any problems in recent years, and that's the way under the law right now. The supervisor of elections counts every election here in the state.
It's funny, there was a time when elected offices were seen as maybe politicized and an appointment process less so, but it almost seems like the reverse is true now, that appointments have become so political that an election might be the least politicized way.
It is very interesting. For example, under our Florida Constitution, we used to have an elected education commissioner in the state of Florida. In 1998, voters changed the Constitution to make that into an appointed position. Well, in recent years, given some of the concern about the direction of education policy in the state, there's been calls now to make that position elected again. So, to your point, Ann, it's that's sort of the swinging of the pendulum a little bit. There are times when people favor that elected approach, and times where they favor a more appointed approach.
We've got a call from Mario in Mandarin. Good morning, Mario. Go ahead.
Oh, good morning, Ann. Thanks so much for this having this important topic, and I appreciate Chris Hand always informing our city of important all the important political issues. And I wanted to just mention, and I'm not sure while I was waiting to come on if perhaps y'all would have mentioned that early voting also permits folks to vote if they don't know what their precinct is, or if they've moved and they're not sure if it matches. Early voting allows folks to go to any one of these sites and submit their vote without having to worry about that. And unless something has changed, Chris, you're the expert on that. But I just wanted to mention that. Thanks very much.
Yeah, that's a good point. People, if they've moved, may not know where to vote. So this opens up that door.
That's right. And I think important to keep, sort of an accurate address on file with the Duval County Supervisor of Elections. But as Mario said, early voting is not tied to a particular neighborhood precinct. If you're voting on Election Day, you've been assigned a precinct at a location that will appear on your voter registration card to tell you where to go vote. Early voting is 24 sites throughout the county. So, for example, if you live in Mandarin, as Mario does, you can go vote at the beach or go vote on the west side at one of those early voting centers. It doesn't matter where you actually go on that day itself, as opposed to Election Day, where you have to vote in your designated neighborhood precinct.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So you mentioned amendments, and there are 6 of them. They are enormously consequential, some of them, but they're all really important for people to understand. So if you can walk us through a little bit, starting with Amendment 1.
Sure. Amendment 1 it's interesting. This is one that I think would have attracted more attention in other years, but for just how visible some of the other amendments have been. But this is an amendment that would allow school board races to be partisan again for candidates for the school boards. We have 67 counties, each has its own school board, to have a D or an R or an NPA after their name. This is a reversal of a decision, or this would be a reversal of a decision that Florida voters made in 1998 when they voted as part of the Constitution to make school board races nonpartisan. So, 26 years later, the legislature put a proposition on the ballot to make them partisan again. One key piece of information to remember about all of these amendments is that they cannot pass with just a simple majority. They require a supermajority, 60% plus one. So Amendment 1 will ask voters, should school board races be made partisan again? Do voters want to reverse the decision they made in 1998 and make them partisan again? So that'll be kind of Amendment 1 that's on the ballot. Amendment 2 would enshrine in the state constitution the right to hunt and fish. This is beginning to actually attract some more attention. There's some editorial boards in Florida that have come out in opposition to Amendment 2, largely on the grounds that this right to hunt and fish is already enshrined in state law. This would give it a higher level of protection, putting it in the state constitution. There have been some concern among conservationists and environmentalists that this might impact some of those efforts. So you're beginning to see more of that attention. Of course, strongly, it was also put on the ballot by the legislature. Advocates of hunting and fishing have been strongly in support of this. So again, we'll have to get to 60% plus one for the election.
We actually did a segment on that on September 23rd, if anybody wants to kind of dig a little deeper. I think one of the controversies there was that it would be the preferred means of essentially culling wildlife would be
Right.
hunting and fishing. So.
Right. Right. And again, I think there's sort of a perpetual question about these amendments. Should they actually be in the state constitution as opposed to just being in the Florida statutes? And we hear that every election session. The two biggest, most visible amendments on the ballot are Amendment 3 and Amendment 4. Amendment 3, which would legalize small amounts of recreational marijuana, usage of small amounts of recreational marijuana here in the state, that has attracted a ton of attention, a ton of spending, both here and from around the country. A lot of questions about, will that get to that 60% threshold? Just a couple of days ago, there was a new poll by the Mason-Dixon polling service that showed it right under the 60% at about 58%. So that's one that's attracted a lot of attention here in the state. Largely opposed by the governor and some of his political allies. Folks that are in the cannabis business, pro marijuana advocates have sort of supported that. There are, of course, a number of other states around the country that have legalized, small amounts of recreational marijuana. So a pitched battle on Amendment 3.
It is made for some strange bedfellows. I mean, we're going to do a program on Tuesday on the 22nd on this with people representing both sides and also a healthcare provider to discuss it more fully. But it's interesting that you have people who are very disparate in their political leanings in favor, for instance, former President Donald Trump and current Jacksonville Mayor Donna Deegan. And then you have people opposed, including the governor, who has been very strenuous in his efforts and kind of varied efforts at trying to defeat um, this particular amendment.
It is not often that you see former President Trump and the Florida Democratic Party on the same side of an issue, but that's the case, as you say, with Amendment 3. It really has attracted sort of an unlikely coalition of supporters. Obviously, this is a major in medical marijuana itself is a major industry in Florida. Recreational marijuana would, have kind of long-term business impacts as well. So that's going to be a very interesting one to watch to see if it gets to the 60% standard. Of course, even more highly visible than Amendment 3 may be Amendment 4, which would reverse the 6-week abortion ban that the Florida legislature imposed in recent years and return essentially to the Roe v. Wade standard that existed prior to that 6-week abortion ban. There had previously been thought to be this reproductive freedom in the state constitution by virtue of the state's right to privacy in the state's constitutional amendment. The Supreme Court ruled earlier this year that the right of privacy did not cover the issue of reproductive rights or abortion. And so as a result, but it did place on the ballot this amendment. As you know, and you've covered on this show, that has been, an extremely visible, active, loud, well-financed campaign with a lot of controversy surrounding it. That is currently, according to the recent polls, polling above that 60% threshold. But again, we're seeing, particularly the governor and his allies very active in efforts to oppose that, including in what has been controversial and is now the subject of litigation, actually state agencies getting involved. The Agency for Healthcare Administration having a website in which they point out what they believe are factual misstatements about issues here. There was a cease and desist letter sent from the Florida Health Department to, Florida broadcast stations that were airing ads in support of Amendment 4, encouraging them to take those down. So it's been a very unusual campaign in that sense, Anne, in that, we typically don't see actually governmental agencies involved with that for good reason. There's state laws that actually prohibit that. But it's been a very active, very contentious campaign, will be right down to Election Day. And again, the key will be, do 60% of plus one of Floridians decide to enshrine that right to reproductive freedom in the state constitution?
I know that we've got a couple more amendments that we want to get into, but I also want to make sure that I'm getting to calls here. Curtis on the north side. Good morning, Curtis. Go ahead.
Good morning, Ann. Thank you so much. Good morning, Chris. Chris, I love it when you're on. Chris, is there any penalty for politicians or elected officials outright telling falsehood? Like the term today is spreading falsehoods about things and outright lying to me. Is there a penalty or law governing that? Thank you so much.
I think the ultimate law governing that is the power that we have as citizens. The former Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and sometimes this was attributed to him, sometimes he attributed it to Alan Greenspan, who was the former Federal Reserve Chair, used to say, "You're entitled to your own opinions. You're not entitled to your own facts." And I think ultimately, the people in this country who have the power to hold either candidates or elected officials accountable for what they say, and I strongly believe they have a duty of candor to the citizens they serve, are the voters. And, through the process we have of elections every 2 or 4 years, depending on the nature of the office, that is ultimately up to us to provide that accountability. Now, if an elected official or a candidate, makes up a falsehood about another person, their or business, there are defamation laws that cover some of that. But traditionally, those laws don't apply to those sorts of people because they're well-known public figures, and that doesn't necessarily apply. The ultimate tool of accountability is us as citizens holding candidates and elected officials accountable at the ballot box or otherwise.
We've got a call from Joe in Arlington. Good morning, Joe. Go ahead.
Oh, good morning. Thank you so much for taking my call. A great show. My question is, why are these amendments written so complicated? For example, the vote no on 2 is it makes basic sense to preserve our wildlife, but if you look at this amendment, that it's so complicatedly written that people would mistakenly vote yes on it when they should be voting no, because it's in our best interest to save the wildlife. So my question is, why are these amendments written so in such a complicated, convoluted manner? Thank you.
All right.
Well, there's a process to get constitutional amendments on the ballot, which includes the proponents of the amendment submitting a ballot summary to the Florida Supreme Court for review to make sure that the amendment meets several qualifications, the so-called single subject rule, that it doesn't cover multiple subjects, also that the ballot summary is considered clear. So what you're seeing on the ballot, on this sample ballot I brought, is just a relatively small portion of what you'll see otherwise, because there is just a ballot summary here. I think this goes to the key point of making sure that you take time to inform yourself about what these amendments actually do and to familiarize yourself with both the pro and con positions so that you have a full breadth of knowledge of where people stand on these amendments. Go to jaxtoday.org, go to news4jax.com. There are other voter guides out there. Those sites have a lot of information about the amendments, what they might do, what positions in support or opposition to those amendments would be. You're going to make the best choice, whatever that is, if you're fully informed as you go into the ballot box or send your ballot by mail.
Got a comment from Alex on Facebook saying it's remarkable that there's a group of individuals that are tasked with the power to throw out ballots if the signatures are mismatched. My grandfather had Parkinson's and couldn't use an absentee ballot because of his tremors. Threatening to throw out his ballot is remarkably undemocratic.
Well, so I think what Alex is referring to is we do have canvassing boards in every county in Florida that tend to be composed of the supervisor of elections, the chief county judge or his or her designate, and a member of the kind of local legislative body, in this case in Duval County, the Jacksonville City Council, that reviews signatures that don't seem to match signatures that voters have on file to assess whether or not those are correct. Now, there is a remedy to that in the event that a canvassing board determines that a voter's signature does not match, a voter has a certain period of time under the law to come in and correct that signature.
But
so
are they
that their ballot.
notified? Like, how would they know?
Yeah, there typically tends to be a notification process. Why it's important to have good information on file with the supervisor of elections office. Sometimes the political parties who are involved in voter protection will participate in that process as well. But there is a signature cure process in state law. Very good point that Alex raises, but also important to know the remedies that exist for that.
Take another quick call from Rebecca in Ormond Beach. Good morning, Rebecca. Go ahead.
Hey, I'm a doctor, a local doctor, and I want to speak out against Amendment 4 because a lot of people don't realize that this amendment, if enshrined in the Constitution, is going to lead to abortions at any time during all 9 months of pregnancy. And I take care of patients that regret their abortions, that get these online pills, and they're having chemical abortions, and there's no doctor except the regular doctor to take care of them. And if we allow abortions at all stages of pregnancy, it's going to be a mess. It's going to clog up the emergency rooms. Women, they don't understand the complications of abortions that can occur. And even if you're pro-abortion, to have no law, the ballot summary says no law shall prohibit, penalize, or delay abortion. That's like carte blanche for the abortionist. You're going to have people like Kermit Gosnell, who was unregulated, perform late-term abortions, do God knows what to women, have no kind of safety regulations or laws. All of us pro-life doctors that have worked for 50 years to enact ultrasounds and mandatory waiting periods, all those go out the window. And all of this is going to cost Floridians a fortune because all of these things are going to be tied up in courts because all the laws on the books are then in jeopardy with this Amendment 4 when it says no law can prevent abortions. All of the safety laws on the books are then going to be litigated. So this thing is written so vague, so deceptive. And I just urge Floridians, you might be upset with the 6 to 8 week heartbeat protection law that's on the books now, but don't vote for this mistakenly because it's going to be a safety nightmare for a woman and it's going to cost Florida an awful lot.
Thanks, Rebecca. What is your specialty?
Family medicine, and I take care of women gynecologically.
Excellent. Thank you. Chris?
Well, I just want to make sure, and I think those who are proponents of Amendment 4, may disagree with Rebecca's position of that. But for all voters, I just want to make sure people are clear on what the ballot summary says. What it says, and I'm reading directly from the sample ballot, no law shall prohibit, penalize, delay, or restrict abortion before viability or when necessary to protect the patient's health as determined by the patient's healthcare provider. This amendment does not change the legislature's constitutional authority to require notification to a parent or guardian before a minor has an abortion. So it's the sort of time frame here is before viability. That was a concept that was established in Roe v. Wade when the Supreme Court handed that down. So again, by the strict language of this, that time period is a before viability time period, which again historically has been seen at about 24 weeks, I believe. So I just wanted to be clear for people listening today what the ballot summary actually says. It does establish viability as a time frame, prior to which the state cannot restrict some of those reproductive rights.
I mean, earlier you said that this mimicked Roe, like kind of before Roe was overturned. Does that viability and, perhaps beyond with the assessment of a healthcare provider, is that unique in this amendment, or is that also mimic what was true under Roe?
I mean, I think this entire amendment was patterned essentially to restore what the law in Florida was prior to the 6-week ban. And this is not uncommon. We've seen some of this language in other states around the country that have reacted to the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in the Dobbs decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. So in a variety of states, you've seen this sort of language to return to the kind of Roe v. Wade standard in individual states, whether that's Ohio or Kansas or other states that have had this on the ballot. It's been a similar approach in many of those states.
All right. We've got a call from Susan in Mandarin. Good morning, Susan. Go ahead.
Yes, I appreciate you clearing up some of the falsehoods that the caller said, but I'd also like to add that what she said about some of the abortion pills that you can take, they are very safe, and in rare cases, something will happen. And if we don't have a legal abortion law, it will be harder for her to get care, as happened in Georgia when a recent woman wasn't able to get care. So this is a very important amendment, and I hope people will vote yes. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. We're going to probably have to leave it there, Chris. There's so much to talk about in this election. We didn't get to a couple of the amendments, but I would just take your kind of closing thoughts for people as they head into this really important election season.
What I would say to every listener is you have the most important role in democracy, citizen. This is the most fundamental way to exercise your effective citizenship skills. Inform yourself, have a plan, go to places like jaxtoday.org or news4jax.com to make sure you are fully familiar with each of these issues or contests on the ballot. And Ann, I'll look forward to seeing you on Wednesday, November the 6th, when we unpack election results.
It's going to feel like an early morning or a late night still.
One of the other.
Chris Ann, I look forward to seeing you as well. Thank you so much for coming on the program. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ann.